So in November 1879, several members that were living in the area went to Victoria and made patent to Victoria to make Surrey a municipality. The council decided to start meeting in 1881 and decided that they would make Surrey Centre as the complete business centre. So 1881, I bring that up because today where we're filming here is actually the 1881 Town Hall. And it's a really unique hall. We'll show a few pictures of it in a few minutes, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. But we're really fortunate to have this hall because it's the longest standing wooden hall in all of BC, and it's saved. So a little bit more about the area. The area for the Surrey Centre Town Hall, the church, the school, the cemetery was actually donated by a man named Abraham Huck. Abraham Huck was the first settler on record in the area, and he was first noted to be here around 1872. There's likely other people that came before him, settlers, but when they started making records, he was the first one on record. His family came up the Serpentine River by boat, and they homesteaded where the cemetery and the Christ Church now stand. The Huck family were American. Abe was a Civil War veteran, and he served in the Union Army as a blacksmith. His wife, Nancy, was a gardener, an avid gardener, and was well known for her flowers and her ability to just grow anything. But she had an other side that often is overlooked in history. She was a little bit, shall we say, yeah, you know what, I'm just going to say it. She sort of scandalized her neighbors a little bit. And I laugh at that because I think she would have been an amazing lady. And how did she scandalize them? She walked around in bare feet all the time. And can you imagine that back in the 1880s? That which is not done by ladies, but she did. She walked around, she had a clay pipe in her mouth, and she got things done. I would have loved to have known Nancy. So the Hucks, they ran the general store up in the area and the post office. They were the people to know in the area. They were the people that got things done. But they're also known as people who loved their community and wanted to do more. So that's why Abraham gave the land over to the city in order to build the town hall and the cemetery and the church. Now, Surrey Centre Cemetery was actually established by the Methodist Church, and it now has been in been in use for over 135 years. The cemetery around the churchyard, which holds some of the oldest resting areas, is now maintained by the Anglican Church, and we thank them for their help in our research today. The rest of the cemetery has now been acquired by the city, and it's about 16 acres wide. It's 16 acres in total, I should say, and it was taken over in 1924. The cemetery is now what we would call in West Cloverdale. It's no longer called Surrey Centre, but it is, still a very vibrant community, and even more so with a lot of the new construction that has happened over the time. I just want to very briefly talk over a picture that will be shown behind me of how the cemetery was set up when it was started. As you can see with the Methodist church, or how the church was set up, was on one side of the street, and across the way there was Surrey Municipal Hall, which of course is the town hall we're sitting in now. And beside that was the cemetery that went all the way back. Today it's only a very short, small square, but if you do go there, you can see there's blackberry bushes towards the back. It has been said that there were some graves back there. Now, whether they were or not, we haven't completely cleared that up. It would be maybe something for later one day. We haven't done that. But there is some talk that there was some bones moved away from there afterwards when the new church was built. Having said that, this is how it was started, with the long cemetery, and then beside the church there was, for the people who were most involved with the church, were tended to be buried right beside the church. Okay, now it's time to talk a little bit about what's in the cemetery. Now, we have an amazing cemetery, and there's many ways to do a cemetery tour. The way I like to do them is tell you about the families and who they are. I always think as I walk through that if 100 years past the day that I leave this earth, someone's telling my story about my resting place, I've done something right. And so that's what I think of when I walk through and when I tell the stories of these families. We have some pretty amazing families here. I'm only going to tell you a few of those stories today, but I do encourage you, if you are ever in the area, walk through, read about them, find out who they are. We do have some amazing people. I'm going to talk to you firstly about the first grave that we know in the cemetery. When you're standing in the church and go across the street, that's sort of the oldest part of the cemetery. So of course, hence the first grave ever set at Surrey Centre. And that's the one of Joseph Figg. Now Joseph was born in Marsworth, Buckingham, England. And if you look at Marsworth, even today, it's a very, very small little hamlet. It probably was, even back when he was around in the early 1800s, a place of lesser means, working class people. It was a very difficult place to find work, and, it was a tough time. Well, he and his wife, they ended up having a family of 6. They had, 2 boys and 4 girls. When unfortunately, in the 7th pregnancy in 1878, his wife passed away during childbirth. Of course, as we know, that was much more common then than it is today. Well, here was Joseph now with 6 young children, all under the age of, under the age of 6. So imagine 6 kids under the age of 6. What was he to do? So he decided to make the difficult choice. He had heard there was west coast of Canada had some opportunities, so he left his children in care, and he came over here to see what he could do. He homesteaded in the area which we now know as Kensington Prairie, and and Hall's Prairie is those 2 areas sort of. Now we would call it Kensington Prairie, but then it was Hall's Prairie. Just a little hair for those of us that know the area very well. So he came here and he got things going. He was here by himself, but he started to clear his land, and he ended up making a log cabin, and he even got a second story on that log cabin. And he was starting to clear the land to the point that he actually had a beekeeping farm. He was starting to make a little bit of a profit. Things were going well for Joseph. He was quite proud of what he was doing. His boys were now in their teen years, and he was thinking about one day maybe they can come and join. Well, unfortunately, right before Christmas, December 20th, I have to do the right dates. December 20th, 1885, tragedy struck. One of those trees that he was falling, it collapsed, and as he tried to leave the cabin, he was not successful. So he was found later by one of his neighbors, and word was sent back that he had been killed by a tree. Of course, tragedy was struck. He's a million miles away from home at this point, and they sent the notice out to his children. And a few years later, when his eldest 2 boys were old enough, they came out to see where did Dad go? What's this land that he had? Well, it turned out that they loved it here, and this is why there's a good story. It's a sad story to start with, but it's actually a pretty cool story in the end. His first son William, he came out here. He was 23 at the time. He started out as a flogger and a farmer, and then he ended up becoming the first immigration officer in the area. He was patrolling his patrol was the area of Douglas, BC, which we now know as Peace Arch. He also served in the Surrey Council in the very early years, and he worked on road building. So he took to his area as much as his dad did. He saw the beauty in it. He eventually married and had children of his own. His brother, George, decided to also come out shortly thereafter. And while he started originally with his brother, he then moved over and had his own property across the street. And he became also very involved in the Delta politics. He was in the council there. So they, as much as it was very sad that their father died in such a terrible manner, it ended up being a really lucky thing for Surrey, because now we got, 2 more people that came to help the beginning of our new community. I have to tell you a little bit of a story, and I was debating on whether to actually do this one, but it just kind of shows how research always, you think you have your research done and you're never done. I've been telling this story at the cemetery for a long time. Well, this week I was going through all my words and going through everything here, and I found out that there's more to this story. So I figured, you know what? It's a good example of how a job is never done. So Archibald Nixon was a young teenager. He was in Chilliwack. He lived in Chilliwack, but his dad was here as a logger, just in one of the logging camps up in Surrey Centre. Well, it came from World War I, and he, of course, being a young boy and very, he wanted to be part of this. He wanted to sign up. So he went to New Westminster and he signed up and joined the 104th Battalion and began his basic training. Well, as part of the basic training, of course, as we know, it's quite a difficult journey to do, and you have to be in good health. We also don't know, fit for battle or fit was a quick check. Do you look right? Do you have any problems when you see? But there wasn't like today that we would do a lot more tests. Now, you can imagine what it's like in July in here. It can get a little bit muggy and hot and, what have you. And the sad thing is when young Archibald was doing his training in New Westminster, he died right in the middle of his training. And it turns out that he died of something called syncope. And when I do my tours, when everyone's around, I always ask, how many of you know what syncope is? And usually I get no idea. So I don't know who I'm talking to here. Maybe you all know, but I'm going to explain it anyways. Today we would basically explain it as, when football players or in a game now, a young child will die of a heart attack on the field. Well, that's basically what happened. There was something wrong with his heart, and he passed away. So it was really kind of hard at the time. I was trying to research, who is this guy and why is he in this part of the cemetery? And of course, he's got a Commonwealth grave. And, I found out, again, genealogy, when you have a little bit of mind like that, it kind of works because Nixon, Nickson, is how it is on his gravestone. But when I looked up Nixon, Nixon, I found his whole family. So there he was. So it's interesting how it finds. So this week I thought I'm going to check that out and see if I can, things get digitized with more things come available all the time. Well, I started researching. Well, wouldn't you know, here's the interesting part of it. He didn't die. Now, in 1919, he actually came back, according to his, of course, Library of Archives Canada has recently digitized all the CEF records, and I was able to pull them and look through them. And here he is. He came back in 1919. He went back to Rosedale, where his family lived, and he lived out his life. So here's the question, what's that grave? So when I've looked, I went back and I thought, well, is this me? Have I missed something in my research? Nope. If I look at the Commonwealth Graves site and the Book of the War Dead, he is there. It is his date. It is his parents. It is his names all the way through. So there's a good reason why Last Post allowed this gravestone to be here. But yet, if I search the other side of it, the Library and Archives Canada, the BC genealogy, I find he didn't die. So it just goes to show you that, history is a living thing. It changes all the time. And as we get more and more documents available to us, the stories become even bigger. So I kind of find this funny. And one of the things, too, I also found during my research is it says he was 15 years old when he died. He says he was 18 years old. My apologies. According to his birth certificate, he was actually 20. And if you look at the other document, it says he's 23. So you know what? Right now, I don't know. But I do know that we remember Archibald Nixon, no matter what happened. Either way, he did serve our country in some way. And whoever passed away of syncope, we also think of him as well. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the Kells story. The Kells is a very interesting one to me. Now, for those of you that are around here, Port Kells, we know Port Kells. We know it's an area of Surrey. It's in the north part of Surrey. It sort of borders Langley. Now, in today's talk, it's very industrial. There are some places that people live, but for the most part, it's a very industrial area. But how did it get called that? That's, a very interesting story. And it's, as most of these stories are, thinking of these people and who they were, and they were, going to, coming from different areas of the world. And anyhow, this is the story of two Irishmen named Henry Kells. The first Henry Kells, he emigrated from Canada, from Ireland, in the 1850s. We're not quite sure, and we actually don't even know which part of Ireland, but we do know the name Henry Kells was somewhat common at that time, so it was a little bit difficult to find. But we know he was a teenage boy, and he was lured to this area because of the Cariboo Gold Rush. So many people were. So he came over here, probably, big journey to get over this way. That time it likely was around the Cape Horn. It would have been, actually. And he first began as an apprentice shoemaker as he started in New Westminster, as he started to figure things out. Eventually, his sister came out with him. She joined him, and they decided to try and make a little go of what they could do here together as brother and sister. Meanwhile, there was a second Henry Kells that came on the scene. He was from County Cavan, Ireland. He was born in 1842. He immigrated here. Now, he had a little bit of a jumping around to get here, but he actually came out to Canada once, didn't like it, went back, and then came back again, eventually landing up in Clinton, BC. Again, gold rush people. He helped build a hotel, and he decided that gold rush, it was a little bit too hard for him, so he wanted to find other ways of making his money. And he became a stagecoach driver. It was good money. It was always on time. You got a paycheck all the time. It was the way it was. So his trek would be from Clinton to Ashcroft during the gold rush times, and that was his route. He eventually made his way down to New Westminster, where he ran into someone with the same name as him, Henry Kells. So they sat down, they started talking, and they got this great friendship together. They became inseparable, as the story was told. But as telling a story, how do I tell the story of Henry Kells and Henry Kells without knowing which one I'm talking about? So I always call him Stagecoach Henry and Shoemaker Henry. Best way I could think to tell this story. I'll try doing the genealogy when I was doing this research and trying to figure out who's who. Well, here's where it gets more interesting. Stagecoach Henry married Shoemaker Henry's sister. So now we've got 3 Kells. Anyhow, it gets a little confusing, but it's, definitely, it's poor Kells. So how did that come to be? How did they become poor Kells? Well, they started looking, they were sitting in New Westminster going, the gold rush, that's hard work. I'm not saying these men were shirk dirty. They certainly were both hard-working men, but the gold rush was not for them. They had tried building. They had tried road building. They were trying to find a whole bunch of different ways, but they decided, you know what? Look across the river there. They're in New Westminster. They've got a better way of doing this. So right now, when boats come in, they come to New Westminster or they come to Fort Langley. Well, they've got a better idea. Here's this vast land right in between. Let's buy all that land, and we're going to call it Port Kells, and we're going to make it the best deep water port that we can, and forget that New West and that Fort Langley. Who needs them? We got Port Kells. They had grand ideas. So they did this. They built a little wharf, and they got going, and they started doing things, but they didn't expect that when the railroad came in, they'd forget about Port Kells. So it was actually up a little bit when they brought the railroad in, and as such, Port Kells as a port didn't really come together. So I thought, no problem, we can figure this out. So they went and they figured it all out, and they subdivided the land. They made roads, and they made it into, a little town, and they figured it would be great. But the problem is, this was an agricultural community. So it wasn't a city. I mean, it wasn't where there was enough infrastructure to support a town like that. These were farming people. So people would have to buy 4 or 5 or even 6 lots just to make it big enough to do farming. So again, didn't work. So sadly, Port Kells Part 2 didn't happen. So eventually they move on. Stagecoach Henry, he moved off to Alberta, but Shoemaker Henry, he stayed here with Marianne, and they made a go of it. They stayed in Port Kells all their life. They were big community people. But Port Kells as the next best thing didn't happen. But here I think about it, we're 100 years later. They were just 100 years ahead of their time. If they did this now, absolutely they would have made their money. So it's kind of funny how things work out. They were definitely visionaries of their time. Now the Wade family. The Wades were a big part of Surrey Centre for their community work as well as what they did within their jobs. Now Edmund Thomas Wade, he was born in 1848 in England. He arrived here with his wife Frances and their 6 children in 1884. So, of course, Surrey was started in 1879, 1884. So it was pretty, undisturbed land when he arrived here. When they got here, there would be 3 more children. So there was 9 in that family. They first settled in South Surrey and then decided to move up to Surrey Centre, where the town centre was now being built. They named their area Woodland Farm, and that's where they ended up staying most of their days. Now, Mr. Wade was quite a boisterous personality from all that we can read when we read our oral history transcriptions. It shows that he was well-known and well-liked, but he was a loud man, which is it's not a bad thing. He got things done. So he's a big, prominent member in our local government for well over 40 years, and we have a lot to thank for him today. But one of the interesting things that he did do was he was the first, now he wasn't first full-time, but he was the first police officer, someone who worked in a police officer capacity. So if anything needed to be settled as far as disputes or disturbances, and it was Edmund Wade that they called upon. Now, if you go back into the council notes, they actually bought him a gun and not long after so that he could patrol. Having said that, there really wasn't a lot of crime in those days or difficulties, so there wasn't much, but people appreciated his calm demeanor. He was a loud man, but he was fair in what he decided. So, he brought a lot to this area. But sadly, that family was struck with tragedy in 1887 when his eldest son, Edmund Jr., drowned in the Serpentine River. Now, we see the Serpentine River today as pretty calm. It's diked. It's not a large river, but back in those days, it was quite free-flowing and quite dangerous. So he's out fishing with his friends when he was 13 years old and unfortunately didn't make it back. The funeral was said to be the largest ever attended at the site. People from all the areas in Langley and Delta and Surrey and New Westminster all came to Surrey Centre to say goodbye to this young man. There was even a poem that was read and published in the Vancouver Sun, which gives you a bit of an idea of how big this passing was. The next family I want to talk to you about is the Browns. And the Browns are well known in this community right up until still today. Many of the Brown family still live in the area and are still very active in the local community and in various capacities. Christopher Brown was one of the first settlers that came to the East Delta area and later became an owner of the Colebrook farm. So he basically owned all around Mud Bay, the entire Mud Bay area, as well as just down from Cloverdale, just a little bit farther. It's an area, Colebrook Road is the area, and all of that was his. If you look on the maps, you see a lot of Brown land. He also bought land in Vancouver and New Westminster and amassed quite a lot of real estate investments. So for the time that it was, he was quite a large figure in local real estate. But he was also known for his quick mind and his business acumen, and he was asked to serve as the financial person for many societies, and especially even the church. He was the financial treasurer for the church at the time. Now, he was from Ireland, and he was born in 1853. He sailed to America in 1874 with the intention to actually stay in San Francisco. But when he got there and was there for about 4 years, he found it was not his thing. It was just way too busy for what he wanted, and he knew he could do better, so that's why he came up here. That same year, he married an English lady named Sarah Thompson. Irish lady, my apologies. And they had 8 children. In 1908, though, pretty much at the height of when he was amassing all this land, he had a premonition that he wasn't going to make it. He woke up one morning and he said to Sarah, "We have to get our affairs in order. Something's going to happen." She kind of looked at him and went, "Okay, whatever, but sure, we'll do what we got to do." So they decided to make a trip back home to Ireland, which, imagine in those days going back, it's not a normal thing. But he and Sarah traveled all the way back to their hometown. They spent several months visiting all the friends that they knew. They came back. Their son, by that point, one of their sons was living in Montreal, going to school. They went and visited him, and along friends along the way. Well, wouldn't you know it, the week after he came back, he was on his way up to the New Westminster Market when his buggy hit a rock in the road, and he was thrown from the carriage, hitting his head, and he passed away. So, maybe he did have some sort of premonition that was going on. So I want to also bring to attention, though, one of his sons, Joseph T. Brown, he ended up becoming one of our more longer-running mayors in Surrey. He was born in 1883, and he was known as Joe Brown. What's interesting about him is, when you think of how he was when he first became mayor in 1900, Surrey had a population of 400 people. But by the time that he retired in 1940, there was 40,000 people. So can you imagine being a mayor through the expanse of that? The real challenging time in the city. It's also interesting to note that he's well known for what happened in the 1930s. Of course, after the stock market and everything, it was the Depression. We were no different here. We had the hungry 30s. We had a lot of people unemployed. We had 3 relief camps here where men who weren't working were allowed to work on the roads or do tree planting or what have you for a meager pay, but that was what he was involved in, helping set that up to help his community. He was involved in the Diking Commission. He became the chairman of the Diking Commission, which we can thank him today for what he has accomplished with getting our dike up in order. But most interestingly, the 1912 Municipal Hall, which succeeds this building we're in today, was his planning. And today it is where we now have the Surrey Archives. Another family I want to tell you about today is Robert Hornby. Robert was born in Shrewsbury, England in 1835, and very quickly he was pulled into military life. He joined the Imperial Army as a young man, and he eventually made the rank of major. He married a lady named Lucy Turner, and they emigrated to the U.S. in 1883, first and settling in Chehalis, Washington. There they bought large tracts of land, but they just couldn't feel settled. It wasn't like England. It wasn't what they wanted to be. So they decided that they wanted to move to a Commonwealth country. So they moved up north, and they decided on Surrey Centre as their new home. It was there that they built a very large home, and they started some really serious farming. They worked on how they could support the economy and support what was happening in BC at the time. They were known for growing chicory and hops and potatoes. But what was interesting about what they did is they learned a good way of dehydrating all this so it could be shipped. So it ended up being shipped up to the goldfields. So they're a big part of how people were fed while up in the goldfields. They made a lot of money doing that. They did quite well for themselves. But they also had a very large family. They had 11 children. So interesting kind of story. I could go on about what they do, but the reason I really wanted to bring up the story of the Hornbys was something that their son was involved in. Now, in 1911, their son, Henry, he was a young man at the time, there was fear all around the city. And if you read the newspapers around that time, Stanley Park was having a very difficult time with their animals. Something was coming in and killing them every night. And it became, when you read newspapers of that time, it's very, you think we have sensationalists today? Not even close to what they had in 1911. So you'd see these big plastered billboards of, treacherous creature marauding through the zoo overnight, and, they couldn't figure out what this was. So over time, you see these newspaper articles in October 1911 showing increasing fear. Something was killing all these animals at the zoo, and they couldn't figure it out. They couldn't track it. At one point, they apparently brought in the SWAT team, or what was considered the SWAT team from the Vancouver Police, and they still weren't able to find it. So they put an ad in the paper, and they said, for $50, the first man that can come and help us out, we will give the $50 to them. Well, $50 in 1911, that's worth getting on a train for. So it goes back to Henry Hornby, his friend Max Michaud, and George Shannon and their three foxhounds, Sport, Mike, and Speed. They went out on the train, they went down there, and within 4 hours, they had bagged a cougar. That's all it was. It was a cougar. So the day before this happened, they had talked about a 400-pound marauding monster. But when all was said and done, it was a 137-pound female cougar that caused all this fuss. Well, that carcass was actually stuffed, and it's now in the hands of the Vancouver Museum. But it was actually in the storefront of the newspaper up until 1947. It was a very big deal that what these men did. So one thing I did have to laugh about was how they described the day after. Well, the reason that the 3 men from Cloverdale bagged the cougar was that they were from where gentle folk don't live. They were from nature. They were not where civilized people are. So that's why they were able to attune with this cougar. Anyways, it just shows how sensationalism, that's newspapers, tells a good story. Okay. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of the more important figures of our town, Henry Bose. And of course, the Bose family, if anyone knows in Surrey, has been around since the beginning of what Surrey is. And still today, the family still is in the local area and very involved. Now, Henry Bose, he was actually born in Hanover, Germany, 1862. But as a young boy, he came over to London. He considered himself English for most of his days. Once he saw England and knew there was more in this world, he really longed to travel. So he ended up becoming a sailor at the age of 19, and for 10 years, he traveled all around the world. But eventually he decided that it was time to settle down, and he ended up finding himself in Surrey in about 1890. His first job, a log jam on Serpentine River. He eventually settled in an area which we call Fry's Corner. Then it would be like Fraser Highway and Highway 17. But it flooded all the time. It was right on the floodplain, and of course there was no diking back then, so he just found it was too difficult. So he ended up moving up to where his family eventually settled, Meadow Ridge Farm, which is, they named that Bose Road, 64th, and it would be approximately just west of 168. And there, he settled, had his family, and became very active in all levels of local government, including being the police magistrate for 25 years, a reeve for 5, and various other positions held in the community. He also began the Surrey's Farmers Institute. He was one of the main builders of the Surrey Cooperative Association, and he was also a chartered member of the Cloverdale Oddfellows. So this man didn't have a lot of free time, but he definitely, made the community what it began. I wanted to mention this today because we're very fortunate, as in Surrey Historical Society, to have his grandson as one of our members. Not just one of our members, our directors. And I owe a lot of debt of gratitude to him for his mentorship. And I just wanted to say that today. So thank you, Roger. I couldn't do this without you. Today we have Bose Forest Park that was dedicated to the community in 2018. This forms part of the original land that Henry Bose had. And it is a park today that can be used by the community. It's gorgeous. It's got so many beautiful trees that, overlooking the city. It's a very peaceful place to go. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Chanterelles. Now, for those who are familiar with South Surrey, there is a Chanterelle Creek and a Chanterelle subdivision, but who are the Chanterelles? I was talking to someone recently about that, and they're like, that's interesting. I was thinking Chanterelle mushrooms. I'm like, no, actually, it's a person. I'll tell you a little bit about Henry and Eva Chanterelle. It's kind of interesting story. They were well-known pioneers that settled in the area of Mud Bay, down by the Nickameckle back in 1873, so even really before Surrey was Surrey. Their property was on either side of what is now known as the historic Stewart Farm. Harry was a deeply religious man, and he was a former teacher at some of the missions around BC. He became the first president of the Agricultural Society of Surrey, and later actually became one of the first Canadian customs officers in Blaine, which was a position he held until 1906. Eva was born in Prince Edward Island in 1861. This young couple, they had 5 children, but during the 6th birth, unfortunately, Eva passed away. Well, Henry, by all accounts, was quite devastated and, again, left with young children. He wanted some way of remembering his bride, so he ended up having a headstone created that is pure marble. It is absolutely stunning, and you can tell by the carvings and the notations and just the symbolism is awesome. It just exudes the love that he shared with Eva. But as time would go after she passed away, his job continued on. He had to work in Washington State as well as here, so he would go back and forth. But he found himself more and more in the Spokane area for his job. He would travel over by train over the Cascades, and it just made him miss his departed bride even more. So he actually did an interesting thing. He had a second tombstone set up in the Spokane Cemetery, and he had his wife disinterred and brought down closer to where he was working in Spokane. Sort of a different thing to do, but of course that made him feel closer. The gravestone, of course, stayed still in Surrey Centre, so now she had two places, but she was resting in Spokane now. In 1910, on the way back during a terrible winter storm, he was involved in what is considered the worst train disaster in the United States up until that time. It was the Wellington train disaster. During that time, there was going along the track when a strike of lightning hit the top of a mountain, and the avalanche was said to hurl the train hundreds of feet off the track and buried them under 40 feet of snow. The storm had also taken out the telegraph lines, so there was no way of communication. The injured, it took days for them to be brought out. Sadly, they even had to rename the town because of its tragic background. There's much written about the Wellington train disaster if you look it up today. It's now named Thai, trying to change the name to something a little bit more with less difficulty. But it's a ghost town, and it's actually quite a beautiful ghost town if you look at the pictures of it today. So Harry was reunited with his bride, and he actually is resting in Spokane along with her. But we do share the marble gravestone that he built in 1893 when she did pass. Yeah. Now, as with most cemeteries, we do have a military section. As you go up from the church, just up a little bit west, you'll find an area guarded off by stones notating the RCAF, the Army, the Navy. And in this, we have several people that are resting that have with full military honors. Now, I could talk about many of them because all of them have amazing stories. But today I kind of wanted to talk about Kathleen Knight. She was a nursing sister. Now, Kathleen, she was born in 1888 in Moncton, New Brunswick. And by 1908, she was studying in Montreal. She was a spitfire of a lady from all counts. She was 5'5", with green eyes and brown hair. But she was really, dedicated to the healing and wanted to make sure that she could do everything she could. So when World War I came along, she was right there to join. She enlisted as a nursing sister and went overseas. She was 27 at the time. She arrived in France in 1915. Now, as an aside, nurses were given the rank of lieutenant. And this was basically so that they could give orders to anyone in the hospital. Because what happens when you're in the bed, but you don't, and there's a ranking system and you can't tell them to, anyhow. So as long as she was inside the hospital, she was lieutenant. Outside of the hospital, she was just nurse. So nursing sisters were served under as you can see on the gravestone, it shows CAMC, and that stands for Canadian Army Medical Corps. Now, some interesting trivial notes. During the time she was in France, she was being paid $111.60 per month, which wasn't a small sum. It wasn't anything to, retire on, but it was a decent pay for what she did. When you think about the time that she was in France, she would have been seeing firsthand cases of not just the war injuries and of course deaths, but she would also seen polio, tuberculosis, smallpox, diphtheria, trench rot. She would have seen it all. She also would have seen the advent of antibiotics. She would have seen blood transfusions, which were a fairly new technology. Surgical anesthesia, so much that came out of the First World War and what we learned from such tragedy. Sadly, though, when you look at her record, she developed something called neurasthenia. Now, what that is it's commonly known, we would call it today as PTSD. So if you read her records, the poor lady had to be sent home because of this disability, as they called it. And the poor lady for the rest of her life dealt with not being able to hear sharp noises. She was not able to sleep. She had high blood pressure. And unfortunately, I think really wanted to bring light to that because, it's something we deal with today as well. And it's absolutely something that we need to discuss, that it has been something that, going through such a tragic event, it is as big an honor to what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying that, shell shock is nothing to be ashamed of. I think it was, I'm proud to see the work that she did on the field and what she would have seen. Now, after the war, she settled here back in Cloverdale, and she began her work back at Royal Columbian. She was active with the Victorian Order of Nurses here, and she did a lot of home care, going around to the community, until she eventually passed away in 1946 at the young age of 58 of encephalitis. She never married. And that's why I wanted to kind of talk about her story, because with no descendants and being away from where she was originally born, she could be often forgotten, and I don't want to forget Kathleen because she did a lot for our community. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Boothroyd family. They were a big part of Surrey Centre in the time. George Boothroyd was born in Sheffield, England in 1829, and he came to BC with his brother William when they decided to go and join the Cariboo Gold Rush. They decided that the actual gold rush wasn't for them, though. They wanted to be entrepreneurs. So they started up a roadhouse and a trading post in the Fraser Canyon, which they named Boothroyd, BC. Actually, if you look on the maps today, you do see Boothroyd First Nation in the area that Boothroyd Roadhouse once stood. In 1873, George decided this was no longer for him. He sold his share of the roadhouse to his brother William and decided to come to the coast. He had married a lady named Mary, and she was Indigenous from the Yale First Nation. Now, as records go, I did find her named as Mary Forrest, or just simply Mary, or Mary George. She likely had another name that is lost to history, and we do know that Mary's family did come from that area from millennia before. George and Mary came down to the coast, and I think Mary's story is very important to us because Mary was just as important as George was in the start of Surrey Centre. At one point, we did find some records that George did try and put some of the land in Mary's name, showing that he did consider her an equal, which in those days wasn't exactly a common thing. So it just shows that Mary was a very strong, important lady. They had 6 sons and 4 daughters, and they settled on the area of Coast Meridian and Mulmaclennan, so basically 60th and 168th, where George was one of the early counselors and a member of the first school board. One of the more interesting gravestones that we do have, just due to the markings that you'll see on it, is the Sada family. The Sadas were a family of Japanese origin that lived in Kensington Prairie. Now, they were Methodists. They were living on a farm close to, would be about 40th and 168th today. But sadly, the father of the family, Kojiro, who is resting here, passed away at the young age of 37 in a farming accident. And when he passed away, he left his wife and their 3 children, who were very young at the time. As was the custom of the day, the widow, married the next widower in the church of Japanese descent. So there became another family. But I really wanted to bring the attention to this because it's a beautiful stone, as the fact is. It has Kojiro's name and his information, but it also talks about where he came from in Japan in the Japanese writing, and that makes it a little bit unique within the graveyard. I also wanted to kind of bring this to attention because this family really actually made a very successful go of their lives. One of the sons, and again, we remember that these children were born into a family that lost their patriarch very young, had a very different upbringing. They could have, had a very difficult life, but instead it was completely opposite and completely surprising. Harold Sada, or Sake, as was his given name, had been born on the farm the same year that his dad was killed. But in the 1930s, he actually became a doctor. He graduated from Kirkville College of Osteopathy in 1929 and became the first acupuncturist in the area. He became well known as the go-to person for acupuncture. And if you think about it, back in, we were talking in the 1930s, acupuncture was a very different thing. So, and there was the Japanese way of doing acupuncture. There was also the Chinese way of doing acupuncture. You could have found acupuncturists in the Chinatown area of Vancouver, but it was in Surrey, in this area, that was something very different. Interesting to note, as I looked it up, Harold Sada, for many, many years, became the person that would be called into the court to explain what acupuncture was. So he was obviously leading in his field. He eventually became a medical doctor. He settled in Vancouver, and he married a nurse where they would live for the rest of their days. But it's really the sister of Harold that I wanted to tell the story of, and she is really sort of, as I see it, sort of the anchor of the family, if you will. Aiko had an amazing voice, a singing voice, and it was said that right in Surrey Centre's church is where she was first heard to sing. She had a very expressive voice and became a mezzo-soprano opera singer. And you think about this community and where she came from, what a bizarre change from here. Not to say that's here, but she was heard by someone who became her benefactor. Now that I don't know who it was, it doesn't matter, but she was actually sent to Milan, Italy, to train to become a professional singer. Now this would have been probably in the early 30s, in around there. I don't have the exact dates, but by 1935 she was signed to the Japanese Victor Radio Company. She began to produce a lot of phonorecords, 78 revolutions per minute, and she would travel all over North America singing opera, very sought after. She was close to her family, of course. So as things changed, and of course we all know, as World War II came for the Japanese people, we had a lot of difficulties, obviously, and as internment came, because of the work that she did, she was able to bring her family out to stay with her in Japan. So while the actual farm that the Sadas did own was confiscated by the government, the family themselves were able to go and stay with Aiko and stay away from the internment camps. They did eventually come back to Canada, as did Aiko, and Aiko passed away in 1954. But it is, for our little cemetery here, I think it's a really important story, and amazing that such an amazing voice was found right here. The Scott family is a fairly new family in the stories that I like to tell, and it's because it's something that we've uncovered as part of the Surrey Historical Society fairly recently. I just want to go back to when I was talking earlier about the Bose family. Of course, Roger Bose being of the area and his family. One night, we talk a lot about history, and one night he called me up and he said, there's a fellow that used to come to the farm, and he was really into playing sports, and I'd really like to find a little bit more about him. Well, what did we ever find out? What a story. So let me just tell you a little bit about that story. Henry Houston Scott, he was born in Fannin County, Texas in 1855. He was a black man, and he was born into slavery. For the first 10 years of his life, that's all he knew. By 1865, of course, slavery was abolished under the 13th Amendment, and although we don't know much about Henry's life, we have found him in the records as property of a large plantation owner living in Texas. He would go on to marry a lady named Amy when he was 24. She was just 15, and they began to make a go of it in their new life. They originally started to settle in Texas, where they had their first 3 daughters. Then they went to Kansas. They had 2 more children. But by 1894, with all the reparations that were starting to come through the government, they were given a homestead grant in Guthrie, Oklahoma. They did try and help out, start their farm there, but it was quite difficult. And as you can imagine, the political climate and just trying to start a farm from a very rough land wasn't very favorable. By this time, they had 6 girls and 4 boys in their family, and their son Floyd had begun to work for the railroad as a porter. He had been told that Canada was a much more hospitable place for the family to be, so they began to make plans to move up north. By 1912, Henry, Amy, and their 3 youngest children, Floyd, Jesse, and Benola, made the trip up north. By this point, Floyd was working again as a porter and was out of the Cloverdale station, so he had come to see what was around this area. They settled up on a piece of property up where 64th Avenue and like 181 area, and they started a farm there. It was a dairy farm. It was basically a subsistence farm, whatever they needed to do to make things work. Henry found work as a shoemaker down in Cloverdale and various odd jobs for the municipality, and from all accounts was very well respected. That goes to show when we look in the council records of the time, shortly after they came, you can see that Henry would go to council and speak on behalf of his farm and ask for improvements to be made in the community. So this was a very different environment than what they were used to in the United States. We can thank him for having the Pacific Highway actually extended up until his farm. He was not Pacific, 64th Avenue from Pacific Highway. They cleared that for Henry so that he could get his goods to Cloverdale easier. So he wasn't someone that just sat back, and he actually made things better for Cloverdale. Meanwhile, Jesse, the young son, was becoming very athletic and very well received in that area. He began to work at Ioko Refinery in Coquitlam and joined their team. It was a semi-pro baseball. They would be paid for their travel and, a small stipend, but nothing major. And as of that, he's in the Hall of Fame, BC Hall of Fame, as a part of the Ioko Refinery for the championship games in 1923-24. Roy did continue on as a porter and joined the International Brotherhood of Porters. It was a group that helped guarantee rights of those working on the railroad, regardless of their skin color. Benola, she stayed on the farm, and she was helping the family around, and she would teach Sunday school at their home. But it was said as her voice was just amazing. It was that of an angel. Oral histories will speak of how people would stop on the sidewalk just to listen to her sing in the kitchen. Eventually, Amy and Henry passed on, as did Jesse and Roy, and it was just Benola left in 1974, leaving no descendants to carry on the farm. Of course, none of the children did marry. It was this eventually was dismantled and forgotten to time, but these are the stories and why we do share these. When Roger came and talked to us, we began looking, and we were able to find people that did remember the family. And because of that, we were able to work with the city of Surrey to have Henry Houston Scott Park designated on the last piece of property that the Scott family owned. It's now a park for general use, and that was dedicated in 2018. How that comes back to the cemetery, where were they? We knew they were here, so we looked around. And of course, the money wasn't, probably financial reasons, they were all marked and unmarked graves. So Surrey Historical Society fundraised to have a plaque made in their honor, and they're now remembered at the cemetery, all 4 of them together. Stewart. I want to talk about the Stewart family. Now, for those of you that know Surrey, historic Stewart Farm is one of our prime heritage locations to go visit. Throughout the year, and even during this last pandemic, it has been open to show how life was like in this area in the 1800s. But I'll tell you a little bit about who they were. John Stewart, he was born in 1842 in Scotland, and he emigrated here when he was just 19. He originally came to California, where he logged the redwoods. He got the nickname of Black John. He stayed there for 19 years and then eventually came back to Canada, where he purchased his first farm on Crescent Road in 1880. There were 2 farms that he also built around the area, but he used to delight in telling everyone that his biggest bane of his existence was fighting off the Pacific Ocean with a shovel in his hand, because of course you can imagine the flooding that would have happened in that time. Eventually, Mr. Stewart and 3 of his neighbors, as I mentioned earlier, the Chanterelles were one of them, started the diking company, and they enclosed that whole area, that 538 acres, and brought it back to prime farming land. He married Annie Davidson in 1883. Then they had 2 boys. He served on city council in the 1890s and became an active member of the Surrey Agricultural Association before he eventually passed away in 1926. Their younger son, John Massey, he passed away in 1919 as part of the influenza epidemic that raged this area. He'd only been married less than a year and was only 28 at the time. So going back into Cloverdale, I wanted to add a couple of ones that I don't always talk about on my tour, but I thought it was important to remember them today. The Dan family was a big part of Cloverdale for many, many years. Ernest Dan, he was born in Deloraine, Manitoba in 1893, and he served in World War I, where he learned the art of radio communication and how to repair just about anything. He was a real handyman, as handy as they come. When he came back, he decided to put that to use, and he started to fix things for people, where they needed to, until they realized that this was actually a good business to do, and he decided to make a go of it. But one of the interesting things about Ernest, or Ernie, as everyone called him around here, is that he lost part of his hearing. So even though he could fix radios, he could hear that frequency. Voices, not so much. So it was referred to me a while ago that when you went into work with him, you would tell his wife what you needed, and she would yell into his ear what she wanted, and then he would get it done. So he married a lady named Doris in World War I. Doris actually came to Canada as a war bride, but sadly her first husband passed away not long after she came here. So imagine coming to Canada and losing your husband at such a young age. He passed away her first husband passed away of injuries that he suffered in World War I, but unfortunately, suffered for the time enough to get back, but then didn't make it. She went back to England for a little bit, then came back and met Ernie, where they married and they settled on McClellan Road. Doris was a true spirited lady. She was a true Cockney, proud of it, loved to sing and loved to act. She was a real people person. She had also served in the British Army in World War I and was one of the first women that went to France. So she didn't shy away from whatever was needed. They were true community people in every which way you look. They were involved in just about everything that happened in Cloverdale. From the Cloverdale rodeos, they were around for the first one. They helped with the beginning of it, but Cloverdale rodeo was their thing. To the Friday night street parties that would happen in this town. Every Friday night, they would bring out music and people would dance in the streets. She performed at the Cloverdale Opera House. In World War II, they both got involved in the civil defense program here and helped build the first ARP hospital. Again, at the time, the belief was that we could be bombed here. So they set up these ARP hospitals in case of that happening. Of course, we didn't have a hospital locally, so that was the best that they could do. When reading about that, they had that hospital up and running within 6 weeks of the call. Imagine that today, trying to get that happening. Granted, it wasn't a large hospital, but the fact that they wired everything together to make it make a surgical ward and everything. It was, they're real handy people and made sure that they did what needed to be done. They had one son. His name was Alan. He took over the shop when his parents retired. Alan continued his sense of community, and anyone who knew Cloverdale in those days would know Alan. Everyone stopped in to say hi to him. He was the man on the street. He was a master storyteller and a lovely man by all accounts. So coming to Dan's Electronics was a rite of passage for many a Surrey resident. Many bought their first bike here or their first TV. They were the first neon sign that was in this area. There were other neon signs in Surrey, but the first one in Cloverdale was at the Dan's Electronics store. They had opened the Dan's Electronics shop in 1921. They closed it in 2013, making it the longest family-owned, continually operating business in all of Surrey. Now, if you think about it, closed in 2013, their son was already an octogenarian. He lived in that store from the time he was born right till the very end, and he passed in 2015. So they lay at rest in the cemetery today.